Hi. Hi, good lunch, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the amazing food. My name is Mara Bolas. I'm a CID fellow, and I want to welcome you here to the CID speaker series with our esteemed guest, Dr. Reshmaan Hussam. As you all know, CID's vision is one of a thriving world for all. And as we stand today, everyone is born with potential, but many may not realize it. And with CID, we believe that we can build societies where all people thrive. Led by faculty director, Professor Asim Khwaja, and executive director Fatima Sumar, CID works across Harvard University and a global network of researchers, practitioners, and students to build, convene, and deploy talent to address the world's most pressing challenges. So we welcome you here today for this amazing talk. Fatima sadly isn't here to welcome you all, but I have the great privilege of standing in for her. I'd like to take a moment to introduce Professor Hussam. She is an assistant professor of business administration in the Business, Government, and International Economy Unit at Harvard Business School. She is also a faculty research fellow at National Bureau of Economic Research and a faculty affiliate not only of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, JPAL, but also of the Bureau for Research and Economic Analysis of Development. She's a busy lady. Her research explores questions at the intersection of development and behavioral economics with research in specific areas around migration, health, and finance. I can tell you that her work is at once novel, impactful, practical, and relatable, providing really critical insights for policymakers who sometimes are heading down the wrong direction. I had the good fortune of watching her TED Talk in preparation of this event, and I recommend all of you to watch it. What isn't visible from her incredibly esteemed resume is the openness of her heart. In the TED Talk, she recommends that for us as development practitioners, where we are often guests in resource-constrained communities, our highest purpose is to listen deeply to people's experiences and to value their humanity. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Hussam.
Everyone. Thanks so much. Thank you, Ma, for that very kind introduction. So here we are. So can I just get a show of hands in this audience, and it's fine either way. How many of you guys are comfortable with regression tables? Okay, got it. So I want to know where I should focus and how I should spend the time. Okay, so I wanted to share today some brand new results. So this is a field experiment that just wrapped up 2 months ago. So we just finished collecting end-line data in the Rohingya refugee camps for this particular field experiment. We're really excited about it. We think that it has some not so obvious policy implications, and we'd just love to hear your thoughts and reflections in this space. So we're tentatively calling it the Household at Work, and this is with our awesome RA from the University of Chicago, Hoya Su, myself, Erin Kelly, who's at the World Bank, and Greg Lane, who's also at the University of Chicago. Okay, so I want to start by grounding us in the context. So this work is in the Rohingya refugee camps. For those of you who don't know, the Rohingya refugee camps became refugee camps not that long ago. It was August of 2017 when about 1 million Rohingya fled a enormous ethnic cleansing episode, now deemed by some to be a genocide, in Myanmar. Many of them fled across the Naf River into Bangladesh, and then built and set up what is now the largest refugee camp in the world and the most densely populated place in the world. And so what we want to do today, the project that we're going to explore today, is going to ask the following question. why does employment deliver psychosocial value beyond income alone? And this builds off of some previous work, which I'm going to share with you in just a bit. But before I do that, let me give you a sense of our broad motivation. So one is the theory motivation, right? In neoclassical economic theory, if you take a labor economics class today, you will understand labor to deliver a net disutility, right? That we engage in an effortful thing in order to get money. The effort is a cost to us. But a previous paper, also in these camps, established that in some contexts, that's not true. People actually deeply value the opportunity to engage in productive activity, even well above just being a recipient of that income alone. Okay, so that's kind of what we established in this first paper. And today we just want to probe that labor supply function, right? Because that labor supply function is not what we have kind of been taught it is. There's a fundamental assumption that we'd like to probe, which is where are you getting this utility from the act of actually engaging in effort or productive activity. And then there's the policy side. So on the policy side, today I want to explore a few margins. So the first is if you think about gainful employment. Gainful employment is a combination of receiving money, the gainful part, and the employment, engaging in something that's at least nominally productive. So that actually translates directly into government policy, right? So when you're thinking about kind of large scale unemployment, how do you design policies? Do you focus on cultivating opportunities for employment, or do you just give unemployment insurance, which would be the substitute for cash? And today we're going to bring in another dimension of that, which is perhaps what people really need is just to be engaged in meaningful activity. So do you just give them volunteering opportunities, for example? What is it that will actually improve the psychosocial well-being of this such a vulnerable population? And then we want to explore a margin of identity, in particular gender. So employment is not an individual phenomenon, it's a social phenomenon, right? So you might experience it individually, but how you experience it is going to impact the people around you. And how it impacts the people around you is likely to be determined by your identity or the identity you occupy in society. Often, this is characterized by your gender role. In particular, your gender role in the household, so being the husband versus the wife. On top of that, not only will your gender identity impact how you experience employment, it's going to impact how the others experience employment. And if we think again about government policy, do we want to be maximizing individual well-being or social well-being? In this case, maybe we think about the unit of the household. So today we're going to take that seriously. If we're thinking about how interventions impact communities, how might that differ from if we were to just measure at the individual level? Okay, great. So I want to recenter us in the context. Here is one Rohingya refugee family. I want to point out a few things. Both of these individuals would have been eligible for participation in our particular set of interventions. They are working age men and women. And if you were to go to any of these individuals and ask them how you can be useful, you would be very likely to hear one of two things: help us go back home and give us work. So we're exploring this question of home, which I think is deeply important. I cannot underscore how important it is and how understudied it is in the migration literature. If that's something that interests you, I would be happy to talk about it. Today, we're not going to. Today, we're going to be exploring this question of give us work. The interesting thing about when they say give us work is they use this term hatir kaj. And hatir kaj, in Bengali, colloquially, it means like handiwork, so something a woman would do. But literally, it means keep my hands occupied. Let me do something with my hands. So it's these sorts of conversations with individuals paired with the broader social or broader legal context that make us think that them just kind of hanging around doing nothing, not being employed, is not something that they're doing by choice, but in fact, something they're forced to. In fact, there's widespread unemployment because they're not legally allowed to work, which is true for most migrants around the world. They don't have legal right to work in their host countries. There's also very limited free flow of labor. So it's very hard for them to get into the nearby cities and towns where they might find informal work. And finally, within the camps, it's very hard to find informal work. Okay, so this is the broad context in which we're operating. Now, back to the question. So as I said, that first paper established that there is some psychosocial value to employment beyond cash alone. Today, we want to probe why. And I want to probe why on two margins. The first is going to be the nature of the work. Okay, so as I said, there's gainful employment. That is a combination of cash and productive activity. Today, we're going to see how much does the productive activity itself contribute to my happiness in engaging with this work. And then on the nature of the worker. Again, this is the margin of identity. Today, we're zooming into gender roles within the household. So what we're going to do is randomize receipt of these interventions by whether you're the wife in a married couple in this household or the husband. And then we're going to survey both individuals to understand what the kind of household welfare effects are. Okay, so what do we do? Also, I should say, if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer throughout. Just feel free to raise your hand. So we're going to be working with 2,500 Rohingya refugees and their spouses, as I said, randomizing the gender of the beneficiary, but surveying both partners. And the field experiment is quite simple. So we have a control group in which you're not getting any work and you're getting paid a nominal fee. I'll describe how much to take some surveys at the end of every week. You have a work group in which you get a work activity, which I'll describe in just a bit, and you get paid for that work. Now let me describe just how much you get paid. There's a parallel cash group in which you're going to get paid the same amount as the work group, but you're not doing any work. And then finally, an unpaid group in which you do the same work, but you just get that nominal fee that the control guys get for the surveys, okay? It's gonna be 6 weeks of employment, which may seem short. Admittedly, it is short relative to a lifetime of employment, but it is quite long and meaningful in this context where most people are not employed. If you're lucky enough to get daily wage labor, you might get a few days in a month, okay? So this is 4 days a week for 6 weeks, okay? Now let me, yeah.
Is it the work of similar kinds, everyone?
Yes, I'll show, everyone's doing the exact same work. And I'll show you exactly what it is, and then you might have more questions after that. Yeah.
How do you navigate the ethics of unpaid labor?
Of
the unpaid labor position?
Yes, that's a great question. So in this case, everything is voluntary, and they also know. So we do the randomization with full knowledge. So we tell them, look, this is going to be a lottery. We have a budget constraint, and so you may, if you're willing to engage in this project with us, you will either be randomized, you will be randomized into one of these four. And if you're randomized into unpaid, it's entirely up to you whether you actually do the work or not. So I'll show you how many people do the work, but it's entirely voluntary. Okay, so broadly, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but you know, as students, if you're thinking about where there are spaces in which we can really build the literature, one space is just this question of the meaningfulness of just engaging in productive activity. There's actually very little literature trying to understand what it is that gives us meaning in work. And maybe it's simply that we're just doing something active or doing something that's at least nominally productive for society. So we're trying to intervene in that literature. Now, on the identity literature and the household level literature, there's a couple things. First, as I said, there's this big policy question. You know, we often think about administering funds to individuals, and we don't think about the spillovers to the household or the community more broadly. And so what should be our unit of analysis for thinking about policy or thinking about the distribution of funds? And then you guys may be familiar with two strands of literature that have thus far been rather separate. One is this literature on male unemployment and intimate partner violence. There's a fair amount of evidence that places in which you experience a great deal of unemployment among men, you see an increase in intimate partner violence. So that's one literature. There's another literature that it's quite mixed. The evidence is quite mixed, but what gets attention is the work on how female employment may increase bargaining power. Okay, so what we're hoping to do is unite these two literatures in one holistic experiment and think about the spillovers as well. And then finally, on the IPV, for example, even though we have a fairly good sense that unemployment leads to greater violence, we don't know why. We don't know whether that's because you just have less money, so you're more stressed and you take that out on the people in your household, or because you're just in the household more, so you have more opportunity to engage in aggressive behavior. And so our design is going to help us get some sense of what are the real underlying mechanisms behind that channel. Okay, great. So let's return to the camps. The experimental design I described to you, but just so you have the visual, if we compare the control to the cash, we get the psychosocial value of cash. These sort of psychosocial measures are going to be our primary measures here. We look at consumption, we look at kind of the standard economic outcomes as well. Happy to talk about those. They move in the directions you'd expect, but that's not the focus of our talk. Then if you compare cash to cash for work, you get the psychosocial value of employment. And then finally, if you compare control to unpaid work, you're going to get the psychosocial value of the activity itself. Okay, very simple and straightforward. Okay, just so you have a sense of the cash payments, control and unpaid individuals are getting less than $1, about 50 cents a week. Okay, is this big? Is this small? Well, let's look at the cash and cash for work individuals. They're getting several times that amount, about 1,200 DACA per week. This is quite large in their context. Okay, so the exchange rate here is about 100 DACA to $1, about. So you can convert it to dollars in your head, but what's more relevant is what does this mean in their context? Well, they're getting, basically the only reliable income they're getting is through rations. And this is 4 times the amount they get from rations, the market value for rations. On top of that, the rations they get are oil, lentils, rice, and eggs. They don't get vegetables, they don't get fish, they don't get spices, like basic things. So they resell a bunch of their rations at a discounted value to get the cash to purchase those things. So if you think about the resale value of those rations, and this is quite a large income shock, okay? Okay, so that's the cash margin. Now let me give you a sense of the work margin. Why did we design the work that we did? So number one, we're constrained by wanting to engage women in the camps, right? So we can't do hard labor and we can't do things that seem socially inappropriate. This is a relatively socially conservative community. The women historically have not been working outside of the home. So if they are to, they should be doing something that fits with this community. And also it needs to be amenable to a low literacy workforce. It can't require the ability to be literate. And broadly, we wanted to design something that was neither terrible and exploitative, nor deeply meaningful and excessively joyful and a wonderful work. Something that's kind of in the middle. Of course, that's totally subjective. So I will show you what we do and you can decide where this falls in that space. Okay, so this is the video we show anyone who is offered the opportunity to work, which is the gainful employment and the unpaid group. And this is what we would show. So here we would say, look, here's this refugee, Mohammed, and Mohammed is thinking about all the different things that an individual might be doing in a camp, okay? And then I want Mohammed to think about the 12 male neighbors near him. And every day, I want him to go around 4 times a day, which we kind of mark by the times of the prayer times that are not at night. And I want him to just mark what those 12 individuals are doing. We don't need to know the names of those 12 individuals. All we just want to get a sense of is how do people spend their time in the camps. Okay, so this is what they're helping us with. They're helping us with a survey activity in which we get a sense of how people spend their time. It's that simple. This is their time use sheet. Everything isn't visual. This is basically an exhaustive list of all the activities a man might be doing. So starting on the top left, standing idle, sitting at a tea stall, bathing, purchasing groceries, etc. And then there's a parallel one for women. So women do this for women. Again, an exhaustive list, sitting idle in their tent, praying in their tent, cooking, taking care of kids, etc. Yeah.
So just so I understand, this means that if the women are going out to work, they're not engaging in mixed gender space.
That's right. Yeah. So they're not a couple things. They're not going any further than they already do for their normal activities, because this is all happening kind of with their neighbors, and they already walk around with their neighbors. And they're not engaging in mixed gender. Like the work itself does not require them to communicate with anyone, let alone other men, unless they want to. So yeah.
So then you'd be isolating the impact driven by the male fear of her going out and kind of interacting with other men or going too far.
Yes, so we actually do collect data on that if the men are afraid of this, and there don't seem to be shifts. And we wanted to make sure that, yeah, we were kind of addressing that potential concern in this. Yeah.
So, do you have any idea on the use of the time they spend on different activities, or it's only the kind of activities? How much time they spend on different activities?
You know, I don't have an answer for you. We do have good data on that because we do collect exactly how much time people spend on these various things, but I can't tell you the distribution right now. That would be a nice chart to show you though. Okay, great. And then in order for them to feel some sense of accountability, at the end of each day, they need to drop off these 4 sheets at a previously agreed upon location. Okay, so that's how far the accountability goes. So this is the work. You guys should judge what it means. In terms of time, you should think it takes about 30 minutes each time, so 2 hours over the course of the day. So this is really like part-time, very simple, not invigorating, but not terrible work, okay? All right, so first I just want to show you that the work was done. So here it is. You can see that those who were paid for the work completed about 97% of the time, and those who are unpaid completed almost just as much. So that itself is kind of a revealed preference measure that even if you're unpaid, you seem to be, wanting to do the work of your own volition. I should say them being paid for completing the weekly surveys is not conditional on them completing this work. So they're really doing this entirely of their own volition. Okay, so now let me jump right into the results. So I'm going to do this in 2 steps. First, I'm going to try to answer that first question on the nature of the work, and then we'll go into the nature of the worker. So, nature of the work. So what I want you to focus on is column 1. That's the psychosocial index, which is going to be an index of all of the other variables that you see. So you have a sense of what goes into the psychosocial index. The thing that I find most important is PHQ. PHQ is this diagnostic tool that is commonly used, quite validated in a lot of settings for depression, so depression severity. Here, anything that's positive is good. So we flipped PHQ and stress because normally a higher score would be bad, but those are all good. Stress and life satisfaction are pretty self-explanatory. Social is the number of people you talked with in the previous day. Purpose and self-worth are kind of interesting. They're questions that we designed that are about, basically we say, think for purpose, we say, think about the person in your community, that's one question, or family, second question, who you find to be the most valuable individual. Rank them at 10, where would you rank yourself? Okay, and it's an index of those 2. For self-worth, it's the same question, but it's about respect. Think about the person in your community or your family who is most respected. Where would you rank yourself? Okay. Control is locus of control, so your feeling about unpredictable events. And stability is how secure you feel today and in 2 years. Okay. So the main takeaway for us is that number 1, comparing work to, well, actually, since you guys haven't seen the previous paper, let me just say, in the previous paper, we just looked at work in cash, okay? And this result holds. So thankfully, in a replication with many more refugees several years later, it holds that cash alone doesn't seem to do the trick. You really need gainful employment. Now we have the unpaid group. Again, unpaid work doesn't seem to do the trick. You really need that combination, right? You need gainful employment to actually experience improvements in psychosocial well-being. And that's what this test right there is showing you, okay? So the effects on unpaid work, you can't reject that they're 0. They are positive in magnitude, the index. I don't want to say too much about whether that's a meaningful boost, but I will say that on revealed preference margins, it seems that people seem to not be suffering from unpaid work, right? They're doing it. Oh, sorry, are we there? No, we're not there. Let me just tell you, they're doing it, right? You have the 94% who are actually doing it. We also do this willingness to pay exercise where at the end, we surprise you with an opportunity for an extra week of work. And we say we're budget constrained, so let us know what you're willing to work at. So many, large fraction, almost actually greater than half, are willing to work at a price of 0. Among those who are willing to work at a price of 0, we say, oh, well, that's very kind of you. We actually have this other option, which is to fill out this survey for which this company is willing to pay you X amount. Both of these would be helpful to us. Which would you rather do? It's up to you. Most people leave that money on the table to work an extra week for free. Okay, and that's true both for the gainfully employed and the unpaid. So there's some suggestion that people do appreciate engaging in work even when they're not paid. We're not capturing it in the psychosocial measure, but you seem to see it in the revealed preference. Okay, yeah.
Are you controlling, or like, is there a way to ensure how willing to work you are based on when did you last work? So in the sense that if I've not worked for a year, I'm willing to take anything that I can to just do something versus my last employment was say a month.
Yeah, that's great. So we have an eligibility criteria of if you have worked more than 10 hours in the previous month, then you're just not eligible to participate in the experiment at all. So I can't speak to the full range of heterogeneity. And then we try to look at how many hours you've worked in the previous month, and there's no heterogeneity there that we can really pick up. I should say on top of that, broadly, this population just has not had any steady employment since they left Myanmar, so since 6 years ago. And the women, the more interesting thing I think is that the women have never been employed in this way. And I'm going to show you the gender results now, so that you might want to think about that as you see the gender results. Yeah.
I wanted to clarify the cash condition. Were they given the same amount of cash as people who were working, or?
Exactly the same amount at exactly the same time. So frequency-wise is the same as well. Yeah.
And everyone in the community, do they know about the other conditions?
So they, no, everyone who was, so you should think there's about 10 people in each block. We're randomizing this at the block level. So everyone who's participating in this experiment in a single block, which is about 150 to 200 households, there's going to be 10 people who are participating in the experiment. They all get either work or cash or unpaid or control. And each of those individuals knows that this was a lottery. So they were lotteried into it. But there are 10 individuals in a group of 500 individuals. So most people in the community are not going to know that these people are engaged in this project. Yeah.
I'm still having a hard time figuring out how you control for the unpaid group, because if it's voluntary and then we can then drop out, the ones who stayed were unpaid, already at a baseline value were higher than those who dropped. Or was there a dropout rate?
No, so our attrition rate is very, very low, and it's balanced across all treatments. And so at N-line, you basically have the same, it's very high, I can't tell you. It's above 93%, I think, for all groups. We're surveying all groups. It's not imbalanced across treatment. And I guess the other comforting thing is that you see them working basically just as much. But even if they're not working, they're part of our sample, they're part of our N-line. We still get to survey them.
Do you expect these results to change over time? So for example, if you do this in 2 months, 6 months,
yeah.
can we create that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important policy and empirical question. So just keep in mind, this is a 6-week program. We do check these results 6 weeks after. We do a follow-up 6 weeks later, and there's nothing that changes qualitatively. But the actual opportunity to work or get cash is only 6 weeks. So you have to, one thing I will say about that is that if we think about a lot of NGO programs, so what I want to separate this from is think garment workers or call center workers. That's maybe not a lifetime employment gig, but many, many years, you gain skills, et cetera. So that's not what this is. But many NGOs, when they enter these spaces, are offering something similar to this. A sort of job that's temporary, you're not really gaining skills, you don't have a promise of future work. So that's where I want you to think about this in the policy realm. Yeah.
Were there significant differences between structures of households, the number of dependents and such?
Great question. So we look at heterogeneity by, for example, whether you have children, and there's nothing, which is surprising, and more surprising when you look at, well, I'll show you the gender results. But yeah, we don't see any differences, nothing obvious. Yeah, okay, let me, we don't need to take stock, you have a sense of what just happened there. Let me move on to the identity part. So the nature of the worker. So the way I'm gonna present these results is that I'm first gonna show you results for treated women. So treated meaning employed, cash, or unpaid. Then I'm gonna show you results for their partners. And then I'll go to treated men and their partners, okay? All right, treated women. So first takeaway is that work is good for women. Gainful employment delivers meaningful psychosocial benefits. That's a 0.08 standard deviation improvement, a very large improvement in your depression severity. And it seems also your feeling of security. To me, this is not obvious, and this is important and a little bit surprising, again, because this is a community of women who have never worked outside the home. And so it's not that they're trying to return to something they knew. They're actually seeming to experience a new opportunity that makes them happy. And again, if you look at cash and unpaid, cash seems to deliver about half of that value. This is actually similar to what we found in our previous work in terms of ratios, although we can't reject a zero effect, and unpaid really seems to do nothing. So for the women, it seems like you need gainful employment to improve their psychosocial well-being, okay? Great, how about their partners? Yeah.
So going back to women, the social index is negative now?
Yeah, so that one, the reason I like the index broadly is because I don't want to make too much of each one, but if we were to wonder why that's happening, I suspect it's because these are women who now have cash and they're ashamed of ashamed is the wrong word. They don't want to engage in conspicuous consumption when their fellow women neighbors are not getting this money. And so they just withdraw, they retreat in their social practice. That seems anecdotally to be something that was happening. Also just broadly something we should think about when we think about delivering cash interventions. Okay, great. How about their husbands? So main takeaway for us is that their husbands are unaffected. In one way, this is good because it means there's no clear evidence of backlash. So there's been a couple papers that have emerged recently that show that when women get employment or cash, their husbands actually increase their the violence towards them. Here, at least, it doesn't seem like the husband is unhappy that their wife is the one getting the work or getting the cash. They are negative coefficients, but they're very noisy. So I'm not going to make much of this. My broad takeaway is that the husbands seem unaffected when the women are working, and there's no obvious evidence of backlash. Okay, but now let's look on the other side. So what if we are treating the men? So here we find again that men, this is like our previous result, the men are doing really well. So when they get gainful employment, they're very happy. Their depression severity goes down. They feel more purposeful. They feel like they have more control in their life, etc. Okay, that cannot be replicated with cash nor unpaid work. Okay, so again, it seems like you need this combination of gainful employment in order to deliver psychosocial well-being. Just paying people, just paying the men really doesn't seem to do much. Just getting them out of the house doing something active doesn't seem to do much. Okay, so far nothing surprising. I think still useful for policy, but nothing too surprising. But what about the women? I'd actually love for you guys to register in your minds what you think is going to happen before we go to the next page and register. Okay, so what happens to the wives? Well, the wives are way happier. So the wives are much happier when their husbands get work, when their husbands get cash. The unpaid is noisy, but the magnitudes are quite similar. And I'll show you some more evidence that they are actually happier. These magnitudes are, you can't reject that they're the same as when the woman gets work, except in this case, they're also happier when the husband gets cash, which is not the case when the woman gets cash. The PHQ, so depression severity decreases or improves quite a lot. Also, I'd like you to note that among the wives whose husbands get work, their feeling of purposefulness and self-worth are also increasing quite a lot, which is notable. Yeah.
Do you think part of what's going on in the background is, so from what I understand, domestic violence on the man's side, it shoots up when his role as a provider, protector, procreator are attacked, and kind of this refugee shock, you're out of a home, you're not able to provide a home or anything for your family, like you would imagine that's threatened.
Yeah.
So I wonder if part of what's going on, I mean, I know you're not directly asking about experience with violence.
I'm gonna pause you and get there, and then I'll come back to you to get to
I was
that.
wondering if that's what's going on in the
Yeah,
background.
let's see if that's the case. Yeah, okay, so far it seems the evidence is pointing to the women being happier when the husbands are working. The husbands are no happier when the woman is working. If we put this all in one regression in which we stick in everyone, so far I've shown you separately for all these subgroups, right? Here I'm sticking in everyone. The interaction of man treated, the way you should think of someone who belongs in that man treated group is either you are a man who is treated, with the work or the cash or the unpaid, or you're the wife of a man who's treated. Okay, that's what qualifies you to be in the man treated group. The main point I want you to just see is that across the board, it seems that when men are treated, everyone is happier. Okay. So we're going to reflect on what to do with this in just a bit, but before we do, let's just get to intimate partner violence. Yeah.
Between when women are treated and men are treated, what's the relative experience of employment? Do women feel happier with employment versus men with employment, or is it the same or less?
So you can't reject that it's all equal. So it was like a 0.08 standard deviation happiness improvement for women when they're employed versus a 0.1 standard deviation for men. So they're close, yeah. You can't reject that it's the same. Okay, so now how about violence? So I'm gonna show you here, we collected violence on men. There's no change there, and also that's kind of not where you would think the channels would go. So I'm just gonna show you two things. What's the violence when the woman is treated in the household, and what's the violence when she's the wife of a treated husband, okay? So treated woman, here, this is the index of verbal and physical abuse. And you see broadly it's negative. So the magnitudes are going down, which is good, it's encouraging, but they're very noisy. You can't reject an effect of 0, okay? And so the responsible academic in me would say we really can't register that treating the woman with employment, cash, or this volunteer activity is improving her safety in the household, okay? What happens if she's the wife? Well, things get a lot better, okay? So intimate partner violence that she experiences, both in verbal and physical abuse across all of the treatment arms, goes down substantially, okay? Just so you know what physical abuse is, we didn't ask how many times were you beaten in the last 2 weeks, because it's just highly underreported. Instead, we asked, what's your tolerance for beating, for your husband beating you? And how many times were you threatened with physical abuse? So that's that's that index. Husband norms is kind of the parallel for the husband. We're asking the husband, how okay do you think it is to beat your wife? We don't really see much on that margin, but we do see it in the actual, what's actually happening in the household. Okay, so again, if we were to combine all this data and do that household level exercise, here you don't see the interactions being significant. But what you see, so the policy relevant coefficient here is the addition of the work plus work times man treated, right? What happens when I administer work to the man versus nothing, right? If you're looking at that, then just go down to the test of whether that's, if you can reject that that's equal to 0, and you can confidently say that it's much better to treat the man in a household on the violence margin as well, okay? So let's just quickly take stock before I move on to the last set of results. Gainful employment seems to deliver psychosocial benefits above and beyond those of cash alone or unpaid work alone. And this pattern seems broadly to hold for men and women. But households in which men receive the employment opportunity exhibit greater total gains in well-being than those in which women receive the employment opportunity. And this also broadly holds for cash and unpaid work alone, okay? So why might this be the case? There's a bunch of, I'm sure you guys all have thoughts in your head, which I would actually really love to hear. Here's a few that we're putting out there. Maybe in this context, but I imagine in many other contexts too, women internalize the well-being of others in their utility function in a way that men do not. It's differential. Maybe that's one. Maybe men's manifestation of unhappiness is one that impacts the other people around them, perhaps through something like aggression, whereas women's manifestation is more often to be more withdrawn, and therefore it doesn't impact others in the household. Maybe there are externalities to your experience of unhappiness. I am kind of most partial to this last interpretation. Perhaps both men and women are just happier with existing gender norms, which they are deeply familiar with and comfortable with being reinforced. And it's really just when I look at that purpose and self-worth, if you look at men who are treated, their purpose goes up, their self-worth goes up. And women who have husbands that are treated, again, purpose goes up, self-worth goes up. So it might just be that these are deep gender norms and they bring you joy to fulfill. It's not something that causes you pain. Yeah.
I'm thinking about that result where men, you said, and also the first from other studies where men sometimes react adversely when the women get employment. I might have just missed this earlier, but how did we control for these people or these households self-selecting, being just households where the men are generally more open and willing for the women to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in a way we don't, because in fact, to be eligible for this experiment as a whole, whether you're wherever you're randomized into, the couple needs to agree that if either of them works, then that's okay. So we're already selecting on a margin of people who, in which men are more amenable to this. So you're right. If we looked at the broader margin, we might even register backlash when women are employed. Right here, we don't. So this, in a way, is a best case scenario. I will say that we do look at heterogeneity among these men in their progressivity. So we ask a question about how okay are you with your wife working outside the block? And we register no difference in these effects by that margin of progressivity. But that's one of many one might be able to use. Yeah.
I was wondering, this might not be something that's been measured, but I was wondering if the usage of the cash being earned by the women in the household is a factor that can affect all these cross-cutting.
Great question. So yeah, we look at consumption quite carefully. Broadly, the patterns are as follows. No matter who gets the cash, husband or wife, the way you spend it is by increasing savings and paying down your debts. There's really no difference across the genders. If you look at what they are consuming, the very interesting thing is, I don't want to make too much of this because it's, just one point estimate among many, but so there's a literature out there that says, look, if you give cash to women, they're going to spend it more responsibly. They're going to spend it on their kids and healthcare and education, et cetera. Our evidence suggests the women are more likely to spend on pan, which is betel, yeah. It's a delicious, potentially drug-like substance. I have not tasted it. I'm just no. It's fun. It's in the group of like luxury goods, and men are more likely to spend it on their children's education. So this is 6 weeks. This is one context. Who knows? But I'm just saying, in this space, it doesn't seem to be going in the direction you might expect.
This might be different because of the community mold, but when we did a similar thing in Maharashtra back in India, we found that the amount of money that was earned by the household, if it's earned by the man, is mostly going towards alcohol, as opposed to other things, but that could differ.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so that's the literature that seems to be out there, that often if it's a man earning the money, he's spending it on alcohol and other luxury goods for himself, and the woman is spending it. And so that's, I think, why we were surprised that in this case, that's not the case, even though the men could spend it on these alternative things. Yeah, and I will also say that no matter who earns, the spouse is also increasing their consumption. So you see the sharing happening in the household regardless of the identity. It's not that the men are hoarding and the women are sharing, for example. We don't see evidence of that. Yeah.
So just on the interpretation of that last point, I was wondering if the channel is that, women's purpose and self-worth is also going up when husband is working. potentially because if there's lower incidence of domestic violence. So when you're suffering from domestic violence, I would imagine your self-worth gets attacked. So I wonder if
That's a great point. Yeah, there might be this kind of circular thing.
I just don't want them to just be happy. But that's a personal.
You mean you don't want them to just be happy because they're wives at home?
I don't want them to find a gender and household norms.
Yeah.
That's my problem, not theirs.
No, so this is part of what I actually want to engage in a broader conversation with you guys with. Because of course, this is not where I wanted the results to go. Like I wanted these women to be super happy in their, so now let me show you the second step, okay? Because the policy implications of this are fairly tricky. But why don't we step back and take the Sen approach, which is Amartya Sen approach, which is there's well-being and there's agency, right? And sometimes they move in concert and sometimes they don't. Sometimes well-being improves, but agency goes down. Sometimes you have to experience a short-term shock in well-being in order to long-term improve agency through redistribution of power and changing social norms, okay? So maybe that's what's happening here. Maybe in the short run, people prefer, retrenching in these gender norms, but among those women who are employed, maybe we're seeing these shifts in empowerment, which is what we really are aiming for as social planners or, paternalistic policymakers. But do we see evidence of that? And the second margin of that is if we were to just give all these interventions to men, maybe it will just retrench their power. And we don't want that, right? There's an uneven distribution of power. Is there evidence that men are becoming more powerful when they get these employment, cash, et cetera? Okay. And so I don't really want to go through all the regression tables. One day when we have a paper out, you can look at each one very carefully. But what I will tell you is we combed the literature for all the household bargaining modules out there. We asked revealed preference questions in which we have people actually bargain over money in the household for specific things that they want. And then we ask a long series of questions on norms, around gender norms around power in the household, okay? Across the board, we see no evidence that men are retrenching in their male power. If anything, for example, if you look at our one kind of most reliable, I think, outcome, which is a revealed preference outcome in which people are bargaining over money, you see that men are exercising less influence when they are treated, not more. And just across, again, a whole host of outcomes, we see no movement in either of those directions. We don't see employed women becoming more powerful, and we don't see employed men becoming more powerful. So neither of those things seems to change. Yeah.
But I understand there is a context here because this finding is little different, and I want to put it in the context like the employment is in short term, so they know it that this is for 6 weeks. So that may be playing a role in understanding this data. Because it's not like I'm getting an employment for long, so I'll reinforce many things, like the other employment.
Yeah, perfect.
So that will be
great. Yeah, so that's exactly where, let me just see where we are. Okay, I want to get back to that in just 30 seconds. So again, let's just take some stock. Gainful employment seems to deliver the psychosocial value beyond the other two alone. And then both men and women seem to benefit basically equally, at least on our psychosocial measure, but households in which men are treated benefit the most. There's no systematic evidence of male retrenchment of power, and there's no evidence that female treated households experience improvements in bargaining power. So what do we make of this? Caveats, it's a 6-week program. It's very short. We explicitly designed the employment program not to impart skills and not to give future opportunities. The reason we designed it as such is in order to make it a fair comparison with the cash group, right? Because that if you had something that gave you skills for the future or future opportunities, then you might think of it as an internship, for example, right? We all work for free because eventually we think it's gonna pay off, right? So we wanted to control for that. That's why we designed the employment program this way. And that's not the case, again, for like garment workers or call center workers, right? So that is a space that I don't think we can speak to. I will say, though, that we have very little, actually, not very little, no empirical evidence of whether that is of whether it's skills and future opportunities and outside options, which are the things that drive improvements in bargaining power for women. So this literature is very, very sparse on that margin. So while it might seem maybe obvious to us that sure, a program like this shouldn't deliver empowerment, but if it did have skills, if it was longer term, et cetera, then it would. All I'm saying is, like, as students, if you're interested in this space, like, that's an open question. We don't yet know. It's something that I'm actually very interested in exploring as well. So what can we learn from these findings? Conservatively, I would say that programs should be aware that distributing short-term services in employment in cash, which is a very common thing to do, is unlikely to generate female empowerment. But then more boldly, we might say that employment opportunities alone are unable to change these deep social norms around the roles of men and women in the household. So you need either long-term interventions or structural transformation, right? We know this from the US in World War II. That's when women actually entered the labor force in a meaningful and sustained manner. There's recent work about how COVID changed the role of women in the labor force. Again, it's like a deep structural break that happened. Absent this, gender-based programs might in fact be depriving these women who we are seeking to help. So with that, and thank you guys so much. There's like, yeah, six minutes. I'll have to answer questions.
Yeah. So one thing I'm trying to understand that this is an interesting is, but one I would say limitations to this is you are not connecting the results with the kind of context that is there. They are refugees. Like, so in that is missing in the entire analysis that I'm finding. I have not read of it, but I'm finding that okay. I would think hypothetically, if this thing will happen to a formal level market level opportunities that is there, let's say the established people, how the results will look like. So it's important to link that with the kind of context, because this is a very different context we are looking at. Yeah. Including the employment, then their empowerment and all. This literature is huge on employment and empowerment, and well-being also. To some extent, psychosocial values. But this is a very different context, and the results also to understand in that context and how it will look like. It will be very, very different than I'm thinking. It will be very different than this space. If you look at this in a different context, like where the formal employment is there and all that. That is one important question I'm finding. Like, I need your response. The second, a short one, is about, I think your sample did not include any spouse, like both are working, or is either one? Is it that?
Yeah, there's never an arm where they're both working.
There is no sample where both are okay, either one. It was deliberate from your side?
Yeah, because if we do both, then you can't control for the amount of income that you're getting. And so just to try to disentangle those two, we were thinking as a government policy, like what you have is a bucket of money. And your decision is not, do I employ, well, it could be, do I employ both in some households and none in others? Typically, it's who do I target? Like, do I target women in these communities? Do I target men in these communities? And so that's kind of the mindset we were in.
Then from which household you like pick the women, which households you pick the men? Was it there any pattern to it?
It was randomized.
It was randomized. Okay.
Yeah.
But my first question is to you.
Yeah, I think you want to respond to that. Yeah.
I think it's still relevant, even though it's a refugee context that does not simulate the non-refugee context. Policy relevant because increasingly we'll see a lot more displacement of people. Just to finish, not just because of climate change, but also because of wars everywhere, and like you have kind of thinking about how to help people in refugee camps. If you don't have this evidence base in designing your programs, you may end up doing more harm than good. So I was thinking the policy takeaway for me was that, okay, we'll be seeing many more swarms of human displacement going in the future. So this is like very useful evidence to have in mind. So that was just my cross-reference.
I'm not saying that this is not important. I'm saying relating the results with the context.
Yeah.
In a sense.
Yeah, I will say on that, I think it's super important because it's true. Like the experience of being a refugee is like a uniquely traumatic experience.
Yes.
The experience of being forcibly displaced is uniquely traumatic. And it could be, for example, that one of the reasons they want to re-engage in these gender norms is because they've been shaken out of them. They've lost them. And so that's certainly a possibility. And I just think this needs to be further explored because you can also think of like cities, Birmingham, in the 1990s, and the immense deindustrialization that led all the men to lose their jobs, right? Like, in some ways, it's deeply traumatic as well, and it shakes up gender norms. And so, of course, this is not Birmingham, but like, how do we think about that, extending it to those sorts of settings? Yeah.
So I'm also struck by the context that women were not working at all before this, so there's no absorption of a social norm around, it's just such a violent departure from what they've been for. And there's work that I did in Guatemala on women's economic empowerment, and I remember talking to some entrepreneurs who said that they felt more lonely as they were happy that they were controlling their own money, they were earning their own money, but they felt more lonely because there were women in their circles who really disapproved of what they were doing. Yeah. And so they kind of lost some friends over it, right? So anyway, for me also contextually, as a policy and programmer, I'm thinking to be aware of what the social, so you have to do this, but to where there's this striking of a departure, there may be a different intervention needed than one where it's more normative. Yeah. And there's some preconceived ideas about this happening.
Yeah, and if we were to dig into the bargaining power results, you could tell a story in which, in fact, those women who were treated, for example, if you ask about do they want their daughters to work or how much education do they want their daughters to have, it actually goes down relative to the other groups. So in fact, while they are happier with the work, they don't necessarily want that life for their daughters. I don't want to overinterpret it, but it's kind of consistent with the fact that there are negatives to the woman working as well. Yeah.
Kind of like in line with what everyone else was given that this treatment was in a very specific context. I'm not familiar with your work specifically, so I was wondering if you knew or had done work in what it's like when the experience isn't in like a refugee context with everything else was out of control. Like, is that same kind of targeted approach in the sense of like, does it achieve the expected outcome of empowering women when everything else is like kind of or is it like?
Yeah, so I have not. My work is all in these refugee contexts because it's motivated by seeing them so kind of despairing by being idle. That said, if you dig into the female labor force and empowerment literature, it's a lot, I would say, weaker in the message than we perceive it. So there's kind of this broad policy agreement that bringing women into the labor force leads to female empowerment. If you dig into the real empirical literature, there's very little evidence of it. And so that's why I'm hopeful that this can kind of spur more of these conversations outside of the refugee camp. Yeah.
I just had a question about like the big picture behind thinking about employment in the refugee context. So when I think of refugee camps as the one that you mentioned, they're meant to be temporary. Mm-hmm. And so by trying to think about policies such as employment that would alleviate the burden on them while in that situation, won't that reduce the urgency of fixing the refugee crisis?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think my sad recognition in this camp, but also talking to people in many other places, is that they are meant to be temporary and they hardly ever are temporary. Right. So these individuals, the refugees themselves deeply believe it's temporary. They expect to go back to Myanmar in 5 years, in 6 years. Everyone else around them knows they will never go back to Myanmar. They know that they will be there. So they're either going to be integrated into Bangladesh, which is politically going to be deeply infeasible, or they're going to stay here for the rest of their lives. So for me, it's this battle between motivating policy that allows them to have a refugee camp versus recognizing the reality of what's happening and knowing that a life without camps is a very likely life if we don't think about these. I think it's a very legitimate. We should be deeply cognizant of the unintended consequences of focusing efforts in the refugee. Yeah.
Thank you very much, first of all. Maybe this point has been touched upon. I'm not sure, I came late. Was there a situation when the woman is working and the man is not?
In this experiment, yes, half of them are women working and men are not.
In a household, in a household, the woman is working, the man is not.
Yeah.
In that case, was the man happy with that?
The man did not express negative emotions, but he was not happier.
They're not happy there, but they don't express.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
that.
I would imagine they would not be happy.
That's also what we expected, especially again in this conservative society, but going back to your comment, like the sample are people who are already willing, the men are willing to let their wife work if their wife is randomized into this. So it's a selective sample. In the broader sample, that might very well be true. I think we're out of, one more question.
Do you want to do one more, if not, Brett?
Sure, yeah. Yes. you have that.
Yeah, so I think totally like when you talk about the example of Birmingham, I was thinking what the result of the study will imply for the future of welfare state in the Western world, like long-term employment.
Oh, you're asking.
No, I
I mean, I just like that direction of questioning. Obviously, this is one limited, I guess now it's two limited pieces of empirical evidence. Broadly though, a couple things. I want to think about how this relates to UBI, right? Like the whole discussion on UBI. What does UBI, there are places in which UBI is absolutely necessary. People just need the money, right? Like to survive. But what does it give you in terms of meaning and purpose, et cetera? So that's one dimension. And the other dimension is this gendered margin, which is that we, even in the Western industrialized world where we think that, you know, gender gaps are smaller, gender norms are more equal, the little empirical evidence we have also suggests that when women enter the workforce, they may stay there, but nothing changes at the household level. Like the women are still the ones doing all the household chores, taking care of the kids, etc. So there's some deep norms that remain very deep. So even in Western context, when we think about how we design unemployment insurance, UBI, employment training programs, who we target, I'm hopeful that this can at least spark some of those conversations on the gender line. Cool, thank you guys so much. How are you?